Okay, we're live. So, good morning and welcome to this live episode of the Philosophy of Information, where we will try to see events of our time with a more philosophical perspective. My name is Andrew Meloche, and I would like to welcome today's guest, Mr. Matthew Ehret, who is the founder of the Canadian Patriot Review and a senior fellow of the American University in Moscow. So, Matthew, how are you today?
Hello, André. I'm good. How are you?
Ah, tu parles français?
On peut débrouiller. It's because you pronounced your name correctly. Yeah. Ben,
No,
ouais,
no,
j'étais à Montréal d'abord. Il n'y a pas une choix.
ouais, c'est ça. You're from Montreal, so thank you for accepting my invitation. I was following your work since a couple of years, and we had you on the show on election night in Canada during election night. So I have a lot of questions for you. You already have them, so it will be more easy. But I think many Canadians, they know you, and they know people around the world. They know you through your research, your article, your conference, and your books. I was watching the 3 books that you have published about global politics and the state of nation, but also about other many interesting subjects. So I will go directly to my first question. What are your political and philosophical interests toward global changes that are rapidly arriving in the second quarter of the 21st century?
Well, I suppose my philosophical current that I come from is if people ask me, like, what are you exactly? How do you philosophically define yourself? Which is, I guess, sort of indirectly what you're getting at. The only thing I could come up with is I'm a Platonist. So I am inspired by the method I have chosen to develop in my own mind as I pursue an understanding of the world outside of me and also my relationship to it. So this discovery of the world internally at the same time comes from my immersion into the dialogues of Plato, which I did over the course of many years, especially through my introduction to the Schiller Institute, which I began volunteering in 2006, which was affiliated with the late economist Lyndon LaRouche. And I became a full-time volunteer and an activist for about a decade, from 2006 until 2017. And a lot of my research methods, my sense of identity, the type of commitments I have intellectually to certain ideas, and thus my discernment, the standard around which I pass judgment over liars and bad ideas or fools, versus what I choose to fight for, is located in a sense of natural law and free will, which I have found to be, again, through the writings not just of Plato, but also other Platonic scholars like St. Augustine, Cicero.
St. Augustine, yes.
Yeah.
More classical philosopher.
Oh, very much so, yeah. And the Augustinian tradition in Europe that emerged out of people like Erasmus, Thomas More, Dante Alighieri. I mean, there's a whole robust school, a tradition, which has an idea of which really recognizes a concept of natural law, an active, loving, reasonable creator, which we cannot know perfectly, but we can know utilizing the powers of reason, of creative reason, not just logic. It's more than logic. Mm-hmm. That allows us to make eurekas, discoveries into the secrets, the secret laws shaping the universe, not gnosis, not the Gnostic idea.
That's a good distinction. I agree with you.
Yeah. So I have to always make that distinction. The gnosis says that creative, that leap, that eureka is intrinsically unknowable and something only an initiate can do through an act of the abandonment of reason. Whereas the Platonic Augustinian type would say that no, that is intelligible, although it is not purely analytical. It does require a poetic attribute, So the best mathematicians who are making the discoveries into the laws of the universe, it's not a coincidence that they are musicians, that they're artists, that they're poets.
Yes, that's important.
That's key, yeah, right? It's that instinct, those higher sense of sentiments and instincts that can be cultivated compositionally inside of us. That's tied to beauty, the higher beauty. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm at, and I'm seeing that the world has been sort of held back by this opposing tradition, which is tied to an oligarchical management of the world, and a set of ideas that posit that human beings are designed to be premised around master-slave relations, with the masters being of higher dominant families that are hereditarily assumed to be endowed with special privileges and attributes that give them the authority and rights to rule over or control the shadows as the puppet masters in Plato's cave over the many. And I reject that. So I find that that's irrational and disgusting. And so I lean towards everything which has helped to bring people out of the cave and become more self-aware of their higher divine spirit. That's sort of philosophically where I stand.
That's good. And I was watching your last conference, 14 minutes. I said, what the hell? They gave this man 14 minutes to expose maybe 4 hours of content. And when David Gardner, one of my friend, he's in Nova Scotia, he talks about rabbit hole. What you mentioned, all those keywords. Yeah. You mean beauty, rationalism, but not only being able to go out of the cavern, natural law, all those concepts that are, I would say, beaten today by those globalists who think that we are only atoms and particles. So that is quite interesting, and that maybe will bring me to we all know the 2030 United Nations agenda, and you mentioned it about the globalists and master and slave and the dystopian world promoted by global elite. The World Economic Forum, and I think in your last presentation you mentioned the Privy Council. So that was something that I discovered. But since the Canadian election in April, it seems time is accelerating, and I will say the locomotive of Donald Trump is starting to slow down, especially because about diplomacy. So my question is toward you about how you feel about what is happening in the south of the Canadian border, and are we witnessing a return to a more moderate global position and a more diplomatic, quote unquote, discourse with the Trump administration, especially in the conflict with Ukraine? It seems that he's starting to understand. Am I right?
Well, definitely the language is preferable. It's a more preferable language, indicating understanding, self-awareness, self-critique of U.S. foreign policy, especially in regards to Russia and the proxy war against Russia that took the form of the Ukraine conflict, and many regime change operations that were coordinated from the CIA's outpost or front group of the NED, right? That overturned governments in Georgia and Ukraine twice before there was a 2004 Ukraine color revolution. There's been manipulation.
The first one with Timoshenko and who was prime minister at the time. Yes, I remember. 2004. That's 21 years ago. Yeah.
And Chrystia Freeland's mother played a role in that one, helping to draft the constitution for Ukraine as well. Like there's this self-awareness with Trump's administration, which, at least in language, has been a breath of fresh air to hear. And I think a lot of the Russians are happy to hear common sense language that's acknowledging the errors of the USA. However, and there have been certain actions, the U.S. aid has been really taken down quite a bit, especially in the European front, not so much so in the Pacific front, as far as I could see. It seems like the destabilization efforts around China have continued.
They're continuing, yes.
Oh yeah, same. And NED had a temporary freeze, but it seems like NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, that freeze was temporary, and now it seems like they just simply went black budget, like they went more opaque. So they're back to being financed again, but now they don't really say where their funding goes. So it doesn't seem like that. Seems like a little bit of a temporary win and maybe a bit of a postponement. So I'm not seeing right now enough policy action that is persuading me that there has been a qualitative change in policy from Bush, Cheney, Obama, Hillary,
Biden, yes.
Biden to today. I don't. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to see more of that, more especially in regards to the anti-China front, but even on the anti-Russian front, I'm not seeing enough yet that's really persuaded me that the U.S. is fully reverted back to a pro-independence, sovereignty, Republican tradition, which was anti-enmeshment in foreign conflicts. That being said, I do see that it's likely, and I do believe that Trump does want to sort of focus the U.S. on controlling its sphere of influence in the Americas. That does seem to be a policy interest that I hear very much, especially around the Iron Dome idea or the Golden Dome that it got changed into. I'm not a fan of that either. But that being said, it does seem like there is an intention to refocus things on trying to consolidate control over the Americas, expel Chinese influence from as many of the Latin American countries as possible. There's a lot of threats that the Pentagon has put on other countries. You know, Panama, for example, was threatened to be invaded by the U.S. military if they didn't sell off their ports that were built by China, and also exit the Belt and Road Initiative, which unfortunately the Panama government said, okay, they will do that. They will exit the BRI. Other governments in Latin America are receiving similar pressures. So, you know, I'm still data collecting and waiting for more information personally.
It's interesting. You know, you're a senior fellow of the American University in Moscow. You studied in Russia?
No, I'm Montreal based, and the American University in Moscow was only a real active university for a small moment in the 1990s, set up by a nuclear physicist, Dr. Edward Lazansky, a good friend of mine who recently passed away. And when the idea originally was for it to be a training, like a university that would train engineers and physicists and others in Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. However, the U.S. side didn't agree to fulfill their side of the bargain. And so it was left without the means financially to pay its teachers. And so Ed Lazansky decided to keep it as a nonprofit, a think tank of sorts that would host peace summits and conferences for the next 30 years, promoting East-West cooperation and dialogue. So that's sort of what it's been since I was asked to participate and help it grow.
Okay, why I say this? My wife is Russian. I went many times in Russia. I speak a little bit Russian. I read practically all Russian literature. Philosopher, it's more difficult because there's not a lot, and you have to find them. And my wife, she always says, "What is diplomacy? What would a diplomat? When you ask a diplomat a question, if he says maybe, it means no. That's the only answer from a diplomat." So, and you know, I study Russia since maybe 20 years, and I'm starting to have a very good understanding about the Russian behavior. So, and it will bring me to my next question, because it's always about global politics. Russia is a superpower. China is a superpower. United States is a superpower. But there are many regional actors like Iran, India, and now we saw last week or 2 weeks ago, Pakistan and Iran. That was quite a shock, you know, the clash they had. And we are witnessing also the conflict, if not the genocide in Gaza. So, but there's one country that is there all the time. We talk about him, but many people don't want to talk about it. So what about Israel? And I would say it's incestuous relationship. Words are important, I think, not only with the USA, but with Russia, because there's a liberal group. They call them the oligarchs. Some call them billionaire. Can we expect a global geopolitical shift? You said you were in data collecting. Are we on the edge of historical change? globally after 25 years of first quarter of the 21st century.
Yeah, that's a great thick question.
I like them.
yeah, I can see that. You pack a punch. Yeah, I can definitely talk to that. But first up, La Poète Russe. Do you also? I was meaning to ask you, when you chose that name for yourself, La Poète Russe. Do you actually write poetry in
I
Russian?
write poetry. I write since 32 years,
Okay.
and I wrote novels, plays, short story, fairy tale, poetry. I wrote 4 major essays. They're all in French, so of course I have not a lot of reader because and I'm a satirical writer. I don't take myself seriously, but I worked 33 years for Radio Quebec, and 32 years ago I started writing, and I did a bachelor's degree in literature and a certificate in philosophy. So I'm like they say, jack of all trades, master of none. It's about me. So yes, Le Poète Russe might be. It's in the honor of my wife. So, but let's go back to you. What about global politics?
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. So I've increasingly trained or honed, I guess tuned, it might be the word. I've tuned my mind to be more and more sensitive over recent years to the eschatological nature of world politics and history. So what does that mean? Beliefs about ends of ages, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean eschatological. It can be cataclysmic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means that there's an idea of the future that has some divine or higher idea of an end of an age and the creation of another age.
Higher goals, yes.
Yeah, that is animating the decision making in the unfolding of present moments, so-called, within a higher context, right? So the way I look at history is based upon conspiracy, for good or for bad, to achieve goals. I mentioned St. Augustine. Augustine had an idea, an eschatological idea of a city of God, right? That in his notion, philosophically, was that human beings would become I don't like using this new age language, but I'll use it, self-actualized. We'll tap into our fuller potentials as a divine species made in the living image of a reasonable, loving creator, and thus be mature, right? So he had that idea of this higher age of brotherhood, of love, of cooperation that would transcend the age of empire, and it would be defined around a notion that human laws that humans create would become harmonized with God's law. So to the degree that the laws that man makes are in harmony with God's law of justice, our laws are legitimate and should be obeyed and followed. To the degree that they are defiant and increase injustice and enslavement or whatever, or division, right, in discord, then they're not legitimate laws. That's a good standard. And so that idea of a city of God in the future being the model around which we actualize our behavior in the present, and we modify our decision-making, our discernment, was that. So there's some sick ideas of eschatology too, right? The oligarchy creates cults. So the part of the oligarchy's management of society is the creation of cults and subcults. We have many examples in history that did a lot of damage, were key in geopolitical disasters like the Crusades, of which those would not have been possible were it not for the creation of the Gnostic cults, such as the Templars, the Knights Hospitaller, and these cults always have the characteristic of, well, two characteristics. One, there's an esoteric inner teaching for the higher initiates of the higher degrees. Number two, there's an exoteric outward teaching for the uninitiated to read the public discourse. We see variants of that in Kabbalah, whereby in the Kabbalistic tradition, there's a notion of the oral Torah, the oral message, the secret gospel of God given to Moses, that Moses had to orally give to his favorites, the initiated, that were passed down as a high priesthood. And then there's the written Torah, which is the one any plebe can go and read if they want to in the Pentateuch, or So there's this this dual teaching you have it also in the Christian matrix in the form of the followers of people like Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer, who is, I think, one of the early figures who infused a Kabbalistic sort of doctrine into a Christian skin. Also, Hermetic.
Was he considered an heretic or?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah. He plays a role in the Acts in the New Testament, where Peter is basically in the story that's officially in the Bible. Simon the sorcerer is passing himself off as a Christian and gets he charms Nero, and Nero loves him and makes him sort of the court sort of priest, and he does magic tricks. He does a lot of magic tricks to pass off the image that he's channeling, summoning angels and demons and doing tricks and healing. So it's a lot of this is magician's tricks. Now in the New Testament, it's sort of still wrapped in a little bit of mythologizing, and Simon the sorcerer, is induced to do a certain trick that involves him failing because Peter summons like a real angel that proves that this guy is unholy, and he goes and falls to his death and dies. That being said, the real figure of Simon the sorcerer was a real figure, and he had followers, and a lot of those followers became the founding fathers of the Gnostic schools, of which there were many, which all had this idea of the secret doctrines, the secret teachings of Jesus passed on through his favorites, namely John and Mary Magdalene, and thus that oral teaching of Jesus could only be known by the initiates because you had to go through initiation processes in order to receive the type of messaging which the vulgar-minded uninitiates couldn't possibly
the initiation. Yes.
Yeah, and a lot of this did involve psychedelic drug use. I do believe that there's a lot of evidence that substantiate the theory that psychedelics, whether opium, psilocybin, mushrooms, ergot, that later LSD was derived from, were part of those initiation rituals. A lot of ritual sex magic, things like that, probably sacrifice of animals, later on humans, does seem to be part of the unification of the sacred and the profane that breaks people, deconstructs them of their human sentiments, and then helps them sort of become reborn in a new sort of more controllable, ego-driven, fake, I guess, spiritualism, where somebody going through that type of ritual abuse, the eating of the flesh, if it's real flesh, killing somebody, doing these things. If you think that you've sacrificed all of that to get this special Gnostic knowledge, you're going to hold on to that experience more seriously, and you will not be inclined to self-examine your false methods because you did so much, you invested so much in it. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this just to get across that these Gnostic schools and formulas, there's a variation for the Islamic world too, permeated both all of the major Abrahamic faiths, and the Templars, the Knights Hospitaller, do seem to be Gnostic cults that carried forth and managed the Crusades. The Templars also had as their home base Solomon's Temple, or the area today known as the Dome of the Rock, where Solomon's mines are located. That's where they were carrying out many of their rituals and worshiping of Baphomet, an androgynous demon figure, which today the androgyny thing is very big in the mystery cults. Zionism, as I wrote about in volume 1 of my Revenge of the Mystery Cults, both Christian Zionism and Zionism per se, for the Jewish variation, does appear to be a synthetic cult creation that was shaped.
Yes.
Yeah, and there are radical elements that have been promoted to try to control the identity of the Jewish people, to convince, and this is a minority, but the idea of the most radical of the Zionist faction that grew out of these mystery cults, especially at the end of the 19th century, took the form of the teachings of people like Abraham Isaac Kook, the lead rabbi of British Mandate Palestine, who had this notion, and he writes about it in his Orut.
They don't hide it. It's public. They write and they expose their
Yeah, it's clearly there in his own writings, and he describes how he believes the New World Order must arrive after a global cataclysm initiated by his people to fulfill a prophecy that would involve a cataclysm that would be induced by his followers, and that would coincide with the reconstruction of Solomon's Temple, the headquarters of the Templars, in order to bring in sort of a grand reset of civilization after a global cataclysm that would involve most of his people being sacrificed on an altar, in a sense, being burned, and in order to somehow be mystically reborn in some new way in order to bring in the Messiah. Now, the Christian Zionists that were incubated at that same period by similar forces affiliated with British intelligence and Jesuits, namely the figure of John Nelson Darby, who grew out of a network in England that were doing certain things called the Aylesbury Conferences in 1828 that revived certain teachings of certain Jesuit theologians around Francis Ribera. They had this notion that to be a good Christian, we have to create and promote for the first time the notion that good Christians have to help bring in the apocalypse. And that apocalypse would involve certain formulas, like convincing the Jews of the world to go and live in this area of the desert, and then, find a way to bring them to a certain place of economic grandeur, but only to sacrifice them all so that they could be reborn as Christians, and the Messiah would come. So you see, that's where I think a lot of this weird, collusion between nominally Christians and nominally Jews who don't really like each other, but yet have found a synergy working towards common disastrous policies like the New Crusades that came out of 9/11. They both kind of hate each other, but they work together because one side believes that the other will be all extinguished and be turned into Christians as the Messiah comes for the second time, and the other side believes that the Messiah will come for the first time and everybody else will be killed, and maybe the survivors will be the slaves of the chosen people. So it's a weird relationship.
Well, you were mentioning master and slave, aggressor and victim, and what you're referring to is that that cause attracts a low. I don't want to be rude toward people, but low intellectual people or low energy people. People who are grounded in materialism, and they cannot. And like you mentioned, I made fun in one of my essays. I make fun about many things. New age vocabulary, how they become like fanatic, and they are defending the idea. Like you mentioned, they invest a lot of time. But it's the ego that is talking. It's not I've made the difference between ego and ethos. How you interrogate your interior self at the same time that you interrogate the external world. And yes, you're right. Do you think today, that's why I was referring to Russia, but global shift, and you mentioned correctly what is happening? You use the word eschatology. A lot of people understand that word eschatology, the end of time or the end of an era. And now we see a lot of conflicts global. Ukraine and Gaza is not a regional conflict. There's an eschatological goal behind that. I think it was the Hannibal Doctrine that was evoked many times after the October 7th crisis or conflict or war. But now we have Yemen and the Houthis, and we have Iran. And from my perspective, when I look at the speech, the discourse, or the exchange, the negotiation, like the West wants to call them, Russian, they have a very different concept about what is negotiation. Do we have international diplomacy today? Does that exist?
Okay.
Especially when we listen to the key actor, I think about Rubio, Keith Kellogg in the United States. But one person I admire a lot is Sergei Lavrov. He's always measured. He's there since 40 years. So he saw all the era the collapse of Soviet Union, the perestroika in Russia. I can talk about it because I wrote a lot about perestroika, the destruction of the civil society in Russia. Do we have diplomacy today internationally? And there's a big difference between the Western world and Asia, for example.
Yeah, it's so challenging, eh? Like, how do you do diplomacy when you have fanatical ideologies that are willing to burn the world for the sake of belief that there were promises made 6,000 years ago for a greater Israel, and
yes,
there are factions that control hundreds of nuclear warheads who are willing to kill everybody, their allies, their neighbors, and themselves in some Samson doctrine, which is another corollary to the Hannibal doctrine. The Hannibal doctrine is like, kill your own people if they're
kill your own people, yes.
Right? Which we saw, and even Israeli helicopter, Apache helicopter pilots even testified from Israel that they were commanded to kill indiscriminately both Israelis and Hamas operatives at the same time at this I guess it was like a concert in the desert on October the 7th.
Yes, it was a concert, yes.
Yeah. So this is a doctrine that's been in play for a long time, and I think both of those doctrines were co-developed around the same time, coming out of the 7 Years' War, or sorry, the 7 Days War, 6 Days War.
You mean in 1967?
67, yeah, and there was a big coup sort of takeover of the more radical, fascisty type of Zionist ideologues around
in the Knesset, yes.
In the Knesset, yeah, and a lot of the labor Zionists who wanted to have sort of durable relationships, economically respectful relationships with their Arab neighbors, they were downgraded and ousted, while the more radical chosen people types were the ones who were brought in and became more and more dominant. They had a small setback with Yitzhak Rabin, who made a bit of a reasonable conversion to humanity in the late 80s, early 90s, but he was eliminated pretty fast. And then his labor Zionist followers were also eliminated.
You mean when I think it was Yitzhak Rabin?
Yeah, Yitzhak Rabin.
He was murdered in 1994. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
He was supposed to sign a treaty with Yasser Arafat, and I remember the picture between Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin and Bill Clinton at the time. They were supposed to be the two nation deal. That collapsed after that. Yes, you're right. So we don't have diplomacy.
It's very challenging. I think, like you said, Lavrov is one of the highest examples of a real old school, wise statesman-like diplomat who's looking to try to honestly use creativity, reason, and work to find people he can talk to as humans who could make deals to bring about a better outcome for a variety of crisis points on the world. However, who is he talking to? There's very few people qualified to even have those conversations among the Western nations, where we don't really have diplomacy. We don't teach diplomacy. These people are trained in high school and universities. They're made World Economic Forum young leaders. They're trained in like model UN brainwashing sessions in their schools. So they have no idea how humanity works, how policy is supposed to be made. They're looking for scripts to follow and formulas to follow that will give them the right answers that they don't have. So I don't know. I'm sure Lavrov is very sad, very demoralized,
feeling very lonely.
Yeah, I mean, he's got some wonderful Chinese counterparts that they were able to make some amazing deals and collaborations with. But I realized that I didn't fully address this. Overlaps the previous question, which was the influence of this Zionist end times faction in Russia. Now, Russia, I don't want to forget that, so I'll just say a word about that.
Go ahead. That's interesting.
Well, in Russia, we know that there's a Jewish state. It's an autonomous oblast, an autonomous state, very independent.
Birobidzhan.
Yeah. And it's
ask me a question. I know everything about Russia. I know a lot.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's cool. But so a lot of people out there are not aware that there's like such a Jewish state, so-called, high degree of autonomy in the eastern part of Russia, and there's a different philosophy of what it means to be Jewish and what Zionism means from many of the rabbis and leading officials who live there and live very well in harmony with their other, you know, multi-ethnic neighbors and other oblasts around them and within, right? You know, it's not an ethno state per se. So there was a debate, and I don't know when it stopped, but I do know that there was an active debate between various rabbis. There was an article that I read in 2009 about how to interpret this idea of the end of this age. And, you know, like there was an agreement. Okay, like there was this agreement that the notion of the prophecy of reconstructing Solomon's temple should be adhered to. But the debate was, why does it have to be? And the Russian side, Russia was sort of brokering this debate between the various rabbis. Why does it have to be right there on the site of the Dome of the Rock? Why do you have to destroy this holiest of holies of the Muslim world in order to build it at that spot? Why can't it be right next to it? What is there in scripture that says it can't be right next to it? What is there that demands that there be some cataclysm? And the point that was being made by the more reasonable rabbis is there is no demand that we have to.
There is no reason, yes.
No. And that seemed like a healthy compromise to both satisfy the need, the deeply felt spiritual need by many Zionists to build Solomon's temple, and at the same time not light the world on fire. And it does seem like the Russians, and especially a lot of the Russian Jews, were playing a big role in trying to bring about that type of more constructive dialogue. At what point that petered out, I don't know. I'm not too sure. I'm a little bit bothered by, you know, the Chabad Lubavitch network.
Thank God you bring it up. Go ahead.
I'm not made comfortable by that. Now, does that mean that all Chabad Lubavitch followers are bad? No, I know very good people who are Chabad Lubavitch. However, it does kind of smell to me like that esoteric, exoteric order.
Exactly what you were mentioning earlier, yes.
Yeah, I feel like there is an emphasis upon many of the scholars within Chabad Lubavitch to study Kabbalah. What does that mean exactly? It seems like there's various interpretations of Kabbalah, but the sort of the type that what makes the Kabbalah nefarious in my mind isn't the outward teaching. It's like theosophy. You know, you read the outward teaching, there's nothing nefarious about it so much. You know, light and life and love, and try to organize your Sephirot and like try to use this idea of the Ein Sof, the oneness that unites the 11th Sephirot as different aspects of the human persona with different virtues we want to cultivate. It's like mental exercises for self, improvement. That's fine. Okay, fine. But then there seems to be this gateway drug through that into a very interconnected secondary secret teaching structure built around numerology, astrology, other forms of going into trances and self-hypnotic states that are very conducive if you have high priests overseeing your trance-like state and schooling you on how to go into self-hypnotism, as well as just deconstructing your mind by going into numerological fragmented modes of thinking about the Torah and the teachings of Moses. You know, like the idea is the real teaching of Moses is not what you actually hear him say or what's written down in the Torah. It's not that. It's literally what they do is they try to break it down into symbols that have sounds, and by just trancing out and going to different sound frequencies, they can tap into the true meaning somehow that they're always guided to by higher initiates, right? So all of that is like a formula for creating brainwashed zombies, in my mind. So that's dangerous. And so how much of that is active and influential, shaping the Chabad Lubavitch networks in Russia, and those who have penetrated quite deeply into influential networks within Russia? I don't exactly know. I know that Putin and Lavrov and others are trying to play a very, very sensitive game of trying to satisfy certain needs and yet at the same time placate or undo, diminish the dangerousness of the more fanatical elements that do want to light the world on fire. So those are considerations I have, but I don't have more satisfying answers beyond those considerations.
No, it's interesting what you're mentioning, because you're mentioning always that, you know, the fact that they want to bring apocalypse to bring the fourth temple, the arrival of the Messiah, and Solzhenitsyn, when he wrote his book 200 Years Together, I read it 2 times. The thin line between what's a Jew and what's a Russian. My wife is always making fun about. She has Polish blood, she has Ukrainian blood, she has Jewish blood, and she has Russian blood. And I said, which one is? She said, it depends on the situation. That's nice. Now I recognize this, and we make fun all the time about this because it's quite complicated. Sometimes we have to use sense of humor to deconstruct or de-inflate the possible conflict. And it's so difficult because we go through, like you mentioned, eschatology. You go to cult. People who are, I don't say they're weak mind, they're lazy. You know, you have to exercise your intellect. Hannah Arendt, she was writing in one of her books, The Crisis of Culture. She said, don't follow the recipe. Exercise your mind. Find a method but you make sure that you know, the episteme, the criticize of the method. You have to be able to criticize your method. Now, I would like to ask you about fascism, because I studied the concept. I had many debate with people. I'm sorry, with a lot of people who are ignorant. And I studied Georges Bataille. He was a French philosopher. He was an anthropologist. I studied him a lot. I studied him at university. I read practically all of his book. And in one of his short texts, the title is the psychology of the structured psychology of fascism. He's describing fascism as a structure in layer. The fact that you have a top that will be impermeable to politics. Politics are there, engineer, academic, they are there to protect a structure of power. And we know about Mussolini. So everybody today, they if they want to censor somebody, I want to censor you, I will call you a fascist. And we have fascist and anti-fascist. And I remember Pier Paolo Pasolini, an Italian writer, playwright, very famous. The 120 Days of Sodom, he put this in a movie. He said the fascists of the 21st century will be the Antifa. And the Antifa are, like you mentioned, they're fanatic. We call them far left. We can have a lot of names. Do we have today, in your opinion, 2025, because we see it, do we have some concrete example of what is fascism, a fascism regime? Per example, we talk about, because you mentioned Nazism in your, I think it was in your small conference, but you referred to that as something we know, the regime of Hitler, we know what happened, but are we really sure about this history? And we know fascism, Mussolini. What is fascism today? Do we see some real example of fascism today? Not to accuse somebody, but try to think rationally.
Yeah. Like ontologically, like where is it in reality? Not to be not to be deflected away by the sophistry of an argument that says one nation is a democracy or a monarchy or something. But
exactly.
But like, where is it really in what makes fascism? And like you said, I think that it's good. I like the way you approached it, because you're looking at like the essence of it, not just like the form of it, because it could have many flavors, many forms, almost infinite forms and flavors. But what is it in the invariant? What's always the case with fascism that isn't there in a truly non-fascist society? Well, I think that, like you said, that upper ceiling, that invisible upper ceiling, past which those who will be shaped by the regime itself are not allowed to permeate physically or mentally. They can't. They're not allowed.
That's important.
Right. That glass ceiling or invisible glass ceiling is super important. That separates those who are the self-professed controllers. Oftentimes they have to justify their right to control, and not just in one generation, but to create systems that will. This is the big challenge for oligarchs, right? Is how do you not just maintain power for yourself, but to create sustainable structures that pass on that authority into future generations. That's where the myth making becomes an important recipe.
Yes.
And Plato sort of alludes to it quite a bit in his Republic. And, a lot of people attack Plato for what he says literally in the Republic as being an idea, or they say often like, hey, see, it's proof that Plato is a fascist. He's talking about the high priest controlling the guardians, creating noble lies and noble like stories to keep the masses in the cave. And the reality is not that at all. Like Plato is what he's doing in that is, for the first time, is he's showing you how the sausages are made. Like if you know how the hot dogs
are process, yes.
Yeah, he's showing you the internal, he's making it transparent, which you're not allowed to do, but he does it in showing you the whole line of process that goes into a society which has noble origins and desires and intentions, but slips into corruption by making certain fallacious judgments about what is the nature of human beings, what is the nature of leadership, what is the nature of law, and by making false hypotheses that they then don't question, they don't self-examine. And Plato, in all of his dialogues, he always examines core axioms, core hypotheses. In the Republic, it's unique because he allows big, false, unexamined axioms to go unquestioned, because he's training his students at the academy to become more sensitive, to think, well, where did we go wrong, right? Where in this exercise did we make a mistake, where we had such noble starting ideas, but then we ended with throwing babies who were born from, bronze-souled babies who were born into gold-souled families, and eugenicizing them by throwing them off a cliff. Where did we go wrong to get to that horrific point? So it's a mental exercise to think about your axioms, but overall, it's really useful because he's showing you how the oligarchy works. Now, again, with unnatural systems of control that degrade humans by design, that divide us within ourselves and with our neighbors by design, it's so unnatural that it requires a very elaborate philosophy and method to keep that going, and also to groom and brainwash the hereditary children who will be born into and be expected to be the guardians to maintain that unnatural system of evil into the future. Because kids will not organically want that. You have to then, so you have to condition your own. So you have to give them sacred stories that will convince them that maybe after their own initiation within, a boarding school of Eton College, or some other boarding school experience where they are molested, broken, terrified, and then, whatever, you're also giving them a spiritual soul food, that maybe you're the blood of Jesus. Maybe Jesus didn't die and maybe had babies with Mary Magdalene, and maybe there's secret societies that have been keeping the blood of the pure divine protected in the noble families of Europe and the hereditary families that justify their existence. So stories like that will be weaved and told to the kids as they grow up and become brainwashed themselves and permeators of their own abuse and become abusers. But always, again, whether it's the Spanish Inquisition or whether it's whatever, even before it was called fascism, anytime you've had a society that has that, and I think fascism is just the most recent incarnation of that, or the most recent political technology that was sort of innovated in the last century and a bit, but it's always got that character. that defines human beings as being machines, some fusion of animal to be conditioned and machines, sort of like we are the sum of our parts as machine is, to be shaped with behaviorist proddings, reward and punishment, and certain entertainments to keep us distracted and confused and disassociated with our true nature. So those sorts of things are going to be promulgated within that society to satisfy the spiritual and material, and then the intellectual brainwashing is going to be designed around a promotion of radical materialism, positivism that denies the mind's ability to make discoveries or to understand what a creative reason is beyond logic. All of these things will be promoted in the indoctrination systems of whatever schools are going to be present in society. So you have the mind, body, soul, threefold component of the human condition that will be sort of shaped to be reduced to not see that glass ceiling. And does it exist today? Yeah, I mean, I think it's super. Even the whole rules-based transatlantic order, especially since the murder of John F. Kennedy and his brother, is mostly feudal oligarchy with a small sparkle of democracy based upon the sacrifices made centuries ago by the founding fathers of America and people who rose to fight for our liberties. They did create a space for democratic institutions to emerge, but they've been drawing down an influence, the House of Commons influence, the Congress, the Senate that are democratic elected in the US, that their influence has been the unions, the trade unions that used to be once upon a time instruments for the individual to organize
the working class. Yes.
Yeah, those used to be super important for the sustainability of true democracy. They've been undermined from Trotskyists and infiltrators from within over the last 60 plus years. So, the democratic component is super minimal. It's mostly feudal, mostly oligarchical, very fascist, I would say, as the dominant driving forces of Western policymaking, especially, like I said, since JFK was murdered, it really accelerated downward. And that's so. It's a complicated question, but that's my complicated answer.
Well, no. I first of all thank you, because this is maybe what I was expecting as an answer.
Oh.
First of all, when we define the word fascism, it comes from fascio in Italy, and it was the party of Mussolini. And the motto for the people or the masses at the time was everything for the state, nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. That's the simple way of defining fascism.
Yeah, the religion of the state.
What you just mentioned in your long answer, and I really appreciate this, the fact that oligarchs or people who are in power and they propose this glass ceiling so you cannot see the top, they also permit academy, institution to nurture their generation or future generation and they have this heritage of perpetrating the fascist behavior. I will use the word behavior because we know psychological manipulation since 100 years. But what you mentioned is very interesting. Fascism is a new word, but the structure and the processes are always the same. It's about domination and having a small group of individuals who will control a big mass of population. In my opinion, that's a very good answer, because you do not focus or you do not target a regime or a country or a group. You go to the core of what would be some characteristic of fascism. That's very interesting. And I would say I would refer to the European Union, but this is not interesting to accuse a group of people or a group of oligarchs, if we want to call them. I don't think that they're very intelligent. They do not propose. They do not expect people to think. They want you to think. They want you to just believe what they say. And you mentioned democracy. You said, okay, the founding father, they created a space with their fight and their debate, they created the space for what we call democracy or institution. And Aranshi always referred to the word institution. We are living into those institutions. But we saw recently, you know, what happened with the European Commission in Europe, who is not elected. They canceled the election in Romania, the first round of the presidential election, and now we saw the European Union candidate. He won the election, and they tried to disturb the election in Germany when the alternative for Deutschland was ahead in the poll. And now it's quite funny because you see countries like Hungary, Serbia is doing, you know, Serbia, they're double agent. You never know where they will stand. It's like Erdogan. He's a dervish turner. So what is the struggle? When we think about what happened in 2020 with the election, I'm sorry for the long intro, the United States presidential election, the process since 4 or 5 years have been disrupted of you know, election and everything, and you know, they always accuse China of interfering with election, accusing Russia. Do you think in the last Canadian election that we had, do you think it was rigged, manipulated, or even with this psy-hop of elbows up, which was completely stupid, but many people fell from it, fell from it? Are we witnessing now, and that would be my question, was it rigged? And do we see a soft coup in Canada?
Before I say anything about that, has my internet been okay? Because while you were speaking, I caught the gist of what you were saying, but the internet began to crap out, and I don't know if it was my side or if it was your side. But have you been hearing me okay?
Yes, I heard you correctly.
Yeah?
Every time. Okay. I heard everything you said.
Okay, so I'll just go into it, and I hope it doesn't crap out while I'm speaking. So, you know, I've written, for those who don't know, who are listening, a series of history books called The Untold History of Canada, volumes 1 to 4, book series between 2012 and 2018. And I did that just to try to give myself a sense of like, what is this strange thing called Canada? And you know, knowing that, being more sensitive than I think most historians have been to the active agency of the real power of the oligarchy and its use of the British Empire as their tool or instrument to express their will to power, to project their intentions and desires onto the earth, especially since I would say the Rosicrucian black magician takeover, led by people like Sir Francis Bacon, Robert Flood, Elias Ashmole, and the creation of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood that took over and transformed England into an empire, and that facilitated the emergence of the Bank of England, the Dutch takeover as well.
The city, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. You refer to the Dutch. I can refer to the future in the 17th century who were financing Jewish bankers who were financing the monarchy at this time. So sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, that's important, right? Because the Fugger operation, I think it was Jacob Fugger.
Jacob Fugger, yes.
Yeah, like
it goes very far.
Yeah, and he was nominally like a Benedictine monk or something, but had this global operation. Not global, but I mean, it was so expansive and evil, and really carried out a coup to remove from influence any of the influence that the better Augustinian humanists that had been influenced by the networks of the Medicis they wanted to basically take down all of those who are not playing by the oligarchical formula, and instead chose to abide by the Platonic Augustinian doctrine that human beings could be made capable of self-government if we gave humanity the opportunity, the environment of peace, the education, and the vision and the beauty the freedom of being creative. If we provided that, then humanity would be much more prosperous, more happy. We'd be as leaders in a better place as well. Although we would have to deny the Gnostic assumption that we are somehow gods, immortals, lording over the slaves. We would have to remove from the elite, so-called, that idea, and have a little bit more of a healthy, humble identity. But that had to be killed, destroyed, and Fugger became the battering ram who was selected.
Yes. But then toward the question, is it a soft coup? And through your books, the 4 books that you wrote, you were studying Canadian history and trying to understand what is this thing.
Yeah. So exactly. Thanks for bringing me back in. But see, so that's the thing. So because I had that sort of sensitivity through my work with Lyndon LaRouche and that organization for years, I had a sensitivity to that phenomenon. So when I looked at Canada, I didn't really look at it from the standpoint that I was expected to, which was I was supposed to adopt the assumption that we are a nation, a crystallized country that makes sovereign decisions by ourselves. And I knew that that's not true. There's always been this shadow empire, this shadow government baked in within us. And that has been used to disrupt the better influences of true humanists and true Republicans that had emerged from time to time inside of the United States, whose murders were often made possible through activities that were set up here in Canada. Lincoln, John F. Kennedy simply being 2 of many disruptive acts that were carried out through and made possible by the British Empire's operations in this part of the monarchy of the North. So why am I saying all of this now? With Carney in
soft coup, coup.
So is it possible that there was election shenanigans? Sure. And I've seen videos online that showcased seeming democratic, baby boomer women who were managing the tables at election booths in Ontario, who were being filmed with garbage bags full of these ballots that they obviously had not processed, right? And these women were very uncomfortable to be filmed, but that was just one example, and there's probably many such examples.
Yeah, but that's small fish. I'm talking more about,
right?
It's small fish. Where are the sharks?
Yeah. So on a multi-level thing, number 2, is it possible that much of the Canadian government has become the Liberal Party? So especially since Pierre Elliott Trudeau, many of the institutions from Environment Canada, the Privy Council, the Prime Minister's office, which is much bigger than the Privy Council, the Privy Council office.
Prime Minister's office, yes. Yeah,
these things are huge bureaucracies that were created, they existed, but they were expanded enormously from 68 to 73 by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. They were staffed with ideologues. The schools, the major universities across Canada that shaped the civil servants are largely the product of a lot of the liberal ideologues that took over and revamped many of these schools in the 50s and the 60s, especially in the 60s and 70s. And so things like Elections Canada, I could see that as also being an instrument for the liberal machinery in some ways. It would be easy to get cooperative ideologues, even though we don't do Dominion voting machines, because that would be my first sign of election interference is, do you have Smartmatic and do you have Dominion voting machines, which Canada does not use. So we do handheld ballot counting still, although we scan it. We do scan them, and then who knows?
And then you count them with a counting machine. Yes.
Yeah. So is that rigged? Maybe. Are the people higher up in the Elections Canada ideologues who are cooperating to make sure that a certain outcome be decided? Maybe. I can't prove it. Is there lower level activists who are doing illegal shenanigans? It seems so. But at the same time, are Canadians really brainwashed? Yeah, they are. And if you want to, if you were Donald Trump, if you were the president of the USA and you wanted to get the Liberal Party in power, the first thing you would do is start threatening Canada with an imperial US-led takeover, or something of that sort, because Canadians have been brainwashed for over 200 years by the British Empire and their school system to be conditioned to be afraid of U.S. imperialism that wants to steal us, our land, our stuff, our water. And so there's this underlying trauma baked into much of the Canadian psyche, including the Quebecois. There's variations of this that have been fed down the throats of Quebecois as well, to be almost hypnotically induced to react a certain way if there is an American threat upon Canadian so-called sovereignty, which there has never been Canadian sovereignty. We've always been under the control of the British Empire, ironically. So it's kind of a sick joke. So I think, I'm prepared to believe that there are enough brainwashed, dumb Canadians who ran into the warm comfort blanket of the big red blanket, and the figure of Carney does sort of embody a sort of archetype, an archetypical lame, reasonable Canadian who speaks a correct kind of language, who's got a profound respect for the institution of the crown. And he's just like that type of square that Canadians who love their Tim Hortons, who just get that emotional, that spiritual rejuvenation when they walk into Tim Hortons. They just feel that I'm Canadian. They get that feeling when they lean into the Mark Carney sort of brand. And so I'm prepared to believe that people actually did this to themselves and accepted this without needing to say that there was a coup per se.
I think you're right. And I could compare the 2020 election of Biden.
Yeah.
They were talking about, Carrie Lake, who was the running candidate for Arizona. She fought for practically 2 years. And they have Dominion machine and everything. I think in Canada, you're right. I think in Canada, we're still we still have a traditional structure. We can hurt ourselves alone. We don't need anybody else. And you mentioned Trudeau. And you mentioned that the fact that the bureaucracy started to become very big with Trudeau. And you said the government is the Liberal Party. I would refer to Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the Communist Party. So I'm still thinking about, I talk about a globalist, a coup, but I will just skip or drift away from my questionnaire or my series of questions, because I have one about what you just mentioned. If the government is the Liberal Party of Canada, okay, it would mean that we don't have any real opposition. And it would also mean that you have somebody above the government who's controlling. And we have a podcast with Payman Ascari and Team Knight, Cerberus of the Improv, and we were talking about law-based corporation, unions, but there's not another layer, but another group of influence. It always come up, the Laurentians, Ontario, Quebec, a group of individuals who are very powerful, and they have this huge influence. Can we identify those groups? We know some names, but it's not easy to identify who really influence the I would not say the government, the Liberal Party of Canada. Is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, I have tended to go. So the Laurentian elite are obviously very real, as you pointed out. There's a local oligarchy for Canada, which has given itself certain privileges, that has their own internal culture. And there's figures, important ones like the Bronfman family, as one very prominent, influential grouping. But I wouldn't say that it's there's somewhat of I think an oversimplified, maybe even a limited hangout idea around the way the Laurentian elite terminology is bandied about in our present day. The Desmarais family, again, is another one.
Yes,
the Quebecois running
the
family.
Desmarais,
Yeah, like sure, like we've got these families. Many of them, when you actually look at them, are kind of nouveau riche. Like they're kind of like the Desmarais, the guy, Paul Desmarais Sr. was what? He worked at a bus terminal and stuff. And then
He started with a bus terminal now. My
Yeah.
wife, she talks about the new Russian. It's the same phenomenon in Russia.
Yeah. It's like, this isn't really like causal. This doesn't get us at the causal nexus shaping policy. This is like, it gets us higher than the illusion of we live in a democracy with the House of Commons representing us, and that's where policy comes from. It gets us out of that stupid place into something a bit more real. But it's like a lot of the configuration of the new, post Union Nationale, post Catholic Church, and Anglican Church dominant structure of Quebec was made possible largely through the Quiet Revolution, la Révolution tranquille, that was affected by certain Fabian Society, Huxley forces.
That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah,
that's what you mentioned. Union Nationale. My grandfather was an MLA for the Union Nationale. So, and no, because when we think about, you mentioned the government is the Liberal Party is the government. So it means that today we are not in a system, a representative system. It's rigged. Not in a way you rig ballots, you destroy. It rigs in a way that we have this. Well, we know mass manipulation from mainstream media. We know what is happening with the CBC, all those national and private media. National Post, Globe and Mail, CTV, Québécois in Quebec. What's the future? So what's the future of information? You are an historian.
Yeah.
You are an intellectual. What's the future of information? Because I made a very big difference in one of my essays, the difference between an information and knowledge. And I will just stick to intellectual knowledge. I will not go into like what you mentioned before, because that would become too complicated. But what's the future of information?
So the difficult thing, and I'm glad that you differentiated knowledge from information, because that's super important. The information theorists that run cybernetics management of society today and transhumanism, they don't want us to differentiate those things.
No, exactly.
Right. But the reality is it's every quality is always comes first in how we interpret the information, because the same information could be presented to two different people who have two different worldviews and sets of values, who will then interpret that information, the quantitative information, in two totally different ways, where one person will be able to use it and make a discovery. The other person will make some garbage model that won't be useful for anything whatsoever and will make them more detached from a discovery. So the thing I want to flesh out a little bit more in detail before I talk about the future of information is that, number one, the oligarchy they create qualitative national myths. They create sacred stories for their victims. One of the big national myths of Canada involves the idea that we got a constitution in 1867. And if you read the John Ibbitson or whatever his name is, the guy who coined the modern Laurentian elites idea, the Globe and Mail guy. So he's the guy who sort of codified the way we interpret the Laurentian elite. Ibbitson is a vetted mainstream CBC Globe and Mail journalist type, right? And he's the one who's giving us this package. And the way that they wire it is to make it seem as though that Laurentian elite, that governing elite of Canada, sort of emerged out of 1867. Before that, there's like this chosen discontinuity, this break. I would say in my research that those United Empire loyalists, those leading Dutch and British families that migrated to become sort of to Canadian sanctuary because they sided with the British against the American Republicans in 1776. Those leading families, many of them who were incubators and promoters of the Hellfire Club operation, the witch covens that had been brought into the colonies in the 1640s, 1650s. This is the Dutch, the Anglo-Dutch occultist elites that were multi-generational and that were brought in to manage the New World as sort of a Francis Bacon
colonies. Yes.
Yeah. And this is so they were all into witchcraft. They were all promoting the Hellfire Club. There's a lot of work that's been written about that. And a lot of them many of them, not all, but many of them left because they wanted to remain loyal to the hereditary system of global control and were given, like the Russians, the Russian traders who were made billionaires in the 90s were given sanctuary in England. So too did they get sanctuary in British Canada. And they became things like the Family Compact. So the Family Compact, which was coined by William Lyon Mackenzie, the revolutionary Republican in the 1820s, who worked with Louis-Joseph Papineau, they were at war with this very internally organized thing that controlled Upper Canada College, the key, McGill University. These were the indoctrination centers controlled by this managerial class of oligarchs. And the oligarchs wanted to convey the story that they disappeared, that they just simply, they lost influence with the Durham Report, and then the new Confederation of 1867. They went away, and then there's a new elite that emerged. No, I think that it's the exact same elite.
Things like continuity,
a direct continuity. Yep. I think that some of the greatest threats to them, which were the true heirs of Benjamin Franklin's operations and efforts in Canada, which included Louis-Joseph Papineau's better self, his son, his nephew, Louis-Antoine Dessol, who was a leading figure behind the Les Instituts, the Montreal Institutes of
l'Institut Economic Institute.
No, not the Institute.
It was more old than that.
Yeah, it was like the mechanical. So it's where they were encouraging the arts, mechanics teaching workshops, trade schools.
Oh, it's Borduas, the painter, was part of this group in 1937 when they wrote the global refusal, le refus global. I know what you're referring to.
Okay, yeah, well, they were big in the 19th century too, and they were like a driving force of republicanism. And Elo David, Wilfrid Laurier in the 1860s.
Wilfrid Laurier, yes.
They ran a journal called the Union Nationale Journal, and the later Union National Party emerged out of this movement. They were called Les Rouges, and Les Rouges were pro-Lincoln Republicans against Confederation in Quebec, who were carrying on. They were being led largely by Louis-Antoine Dessol, the nephew of Papineau, and they were trying to make the correctives, which so why did the rebellions of 1837-38 fail? It was largely, and it was realized years later by Papineau and his nephew, that it lacked the cultural maturity that the American Revolution had gained through the efforts over decades by Benjamin Franklin and his networks to create a more robust culture that could encourage the enjoyment of reading of Latin, of Greek, of Shakespeare, the classics, so that you had that cultural excellence within the American colonies that made it possible to have a durable revolution. Whereas in Canada, they were more hot-headed. They skipped the steps. They were frustrated by the oppression of the Family Compact in the British Empire. They were so suffocated that they reacted too emotionally, too quickly, and they tried to pluck the fruit before it was ripe. So it resulted in a lot of good people with no insight making all sorts of bad judgments, resulting in a lot of people dying, getting executed, and infiltrators that were brought in steered by Lord John Russell, who was in charge of undoing the rebellions. Now, as a consequence of their failure, there was an effort to correct it by encouraging the arts, classical music. Calixte Lavallée was brought in.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
He emerged out of this scene. Quebec became, through this effort over decades, a classical music hub that produced the best Bach cantatas and even instrument making. The best organs were being made in Quebec.
I know. Canac in near Lake Simon, which is in Harrington area. It's an international hub for music, Canadian amateur music, and every year they have a concert hall there. It is incredible. What you mentioned is very important.
Yeah.
So they try to shift from politics, the policy, the politics to culture in Quebec.
Yes, and it was very important that they did that because they needed to create the spiritual preconditions for a Republican citizenry to be able to emerge that could understand what political freedom meant and the type of battle that would be needed if you were going to attain it, which we didn't have. And Saint-Hyacinthe, right? Like that was like one of the biggest like violins, violas, like some of the best instruments that were ever produced in the world were in Saint-Hyacinthe. So all
exactly. The factory was producing organ, cassava organ. Yes, you're right. It's important.
And this was largely because of the Papineau, Louis-Antoine Desaulles movement through the Institut Canadien. That's it. The Canadian Institutes were the names of these things. And they were like little Platonic academies that were teaching the sciences, frontier, cutting edge research, philosophy for men and women as well. And it was encouraging the manufacturing. Back then, technology was seen as a branch of the arts. So it was like a much more robust cultural movement that the Union Nationale guys around Laurier and Calex-la-Vallée were all champions of. Against Confederation. They all recognized Confederation was a trap to undo the potential emergence of a real Canadian viable country. So as a consequence of always having been under the control, falling for the seductive traps of the empire, because we didn't have insightful enough people who understood the nature of the game, the empire has been at an advantage because they've been able to destroy many of the historical records that would allow historians to understand information-wise what was the past. They burnt down the Montreal Parliament in the 1840s. They burnt it down. That was the archives for most of the correspondences and original records of everything that came before 1848 or 49 was in the Montreal Parliament. They just burnt down the archives. So what the empire has been able to, unlike the US, where because better people who were smarter were able to win battles, they have been able to preserve their archives, their original records more effectively in the US than in Canada, where much of it has been. Look at Pierre Elliott Trudeau, right? After 20 years, people thought, historians believed in 2019, they believed that once 20 years had passed, they would finally be able to access the Pierre Elliott Trudeau archive.
The archive, yes.
And they all got there and they were like, there's nothing there. And then the archivist said, oh yeah, CSIS came in 18 years ago and said there's nothing interesting, and they shredded it all and burnt it. So you're like, that was like
you destroy the criminal. They always destroy the evidence.
Yeah, exactly, right? So shit like that's not new. It's been going on for a long time. So as far as information, people need to redefine what information means, because there are not the types of, if you're an empiricist that yearns for sensual empirical data to gratify you, that you always want, if people want a smoking gun to then satisfy their desires, they won't get it if they're trying to do higher research. They have to redefine, they have to start thinking in terms of, they have to start thinking in terms of a method that was promoted by a Platonist named Gottfried Leibniz, who was a statesman, right, of the 17th, 18th centuries. And he was somebody who put a lot of emphasis on his method of analysis situs, the geometry of position. Many of the leading figures who ran the École Polytechnique of France, Gaspard Monge, Carnot, they were all utilizing this analysis situs method when they were making their revolutionary discoveries in everything that they touched. And it basically means you have to triangulate. So the mind has to be able, and this is where classical music is very important, to help train the mind to think about polyphony, multi-voices happening at the same time, all doing something different, but organized for a higher theme, where the mind can train itself to start thinking about what are the baritones doing differently, but in harmony with the tenors, the sopranos, the basses, the strings, the oboes, like how are these things all individually beautiful, but together there's a beauty that's more than the sum of its parts that the mind can think about at the same time. And so you want to be able to think about different processes that don't seem to be directly connected. You know, today we're talking about philosophy. the music, sciences, technology, politics. These are all things that they all are interconnected. The oligarchy knows that they're interconnected and they operate on that level, but most people have been conditioned by compartmentalization to not understand how they could think about them all at the same time, so that you could get better at triangulating in on hypotheses. You're looking for a solution that has no empirical weight to it, but it's an idea, it's an intention, right? So how do you see an intention, a conspiracy that shapes material events? Well, you can't see the intention. It is invisible. It is transcendent. So you can only infer it from data that is recorded, and you want to look for the anomalies. So look for like who's promoting.
That's important.
Yeah, and then who's promoting narratives that we're supposed to take into ourselves and use to map our understanding of the past and thus the future, because the past helps us understand the future. So who are the lying liars who are parts of inner clubs that are commissioned to create the big stories, the big narratives? And where do the narratives, whether it's John Ibbotson, his explanatory model of the Laurentian elites, or whether it's Conrad Black and his explanation of things, or any of these people, there's many. There's a small stable of accepted historians and influencers who give us models. Where do their models break when we look at the evidence of reality? So where are the paradoxes? Where are the anomalies? And that's where we're going to let our minds make more fruitful hypotheses on our own terms that gives us discoveries. And so I think that that's this kind of relationship to information that people need to learn how to develop, because they're not going to get satisfied answers because the empire controls too much of the information landscape right now. It won't come to us that way.
Well, that maybe that leads me to maybe my
and don't even get me started on AI, because that's even
no,
like
I will not. I promise I will not. And I mean, maybe I will re-invite you again, and maybe I don't know if you know Michael Jones.
He's Michael Jones. Yeah, I've done a podcast with him.
You mentioned harmony. He wrote a book. I'm reading it now. I read Baron Metal, which is a masterpiece, and I read Libido Dominandi about psychological manipulation since 100 years. In Dangers of Beauty, he's talking about the being. He's in line with what you're saying, with this intuitive part of the self that has to examine the entire universe, and it's quite fascinating. But toward what I was asking you about Canada, is it possible to evolve? Because, like you mentioned, if people rely on information and information is controlled and manipulated, can we evolve in another model if we don't have a constitution? Payman Askari, my colleague, is writing some proposition. He's trying to think about what could be a constitution. Can we migrate or merge or mute into something that would be called a republic? I think we lost Matthew. Maybe we'll be back. What I will do during this little period, I can add this to the stage, so at least you can see the books of Matthew Ehret that are already 3 of the books that he wrote. Mystery Babylon. Okay, it's back. You're back, Matthew. Do you hear me? You're still there? I don't hear you, Matthew. I think we've been censored by the CBC. You broke, and now I see you, but I don't hear you. Maybe it's the internet connection. That's what I was referring to about. Okay, he's gone. He will come back. That's what I was referring to about technology, how we are dependent on technology, and how if we don't have any contingency plan, they can shut us down, and we can have a very interesting conversation. But we will be stuck with what is happening now. The fact that we outsource our process, that we are in the cloud, and we rely on servers that are not here, we are always dependent on technology, and we cannot have a contingency plan. Meaning that if I was in a room with Matthew Ehret at this time, we would rely on one internet connection. Now we have to rely on two internet connections. The more we are on virtual reality, the more we are dependent on those technology. And maybe if they can control. I think Matthew is back. Are you back? Good. It's okay. I try to fill the gap. But I was talking about the fact that we are also dependent on technology. Maybe one day I will re-invite you with Michael Jones about the what you were calling the beauty, and maybe one day we will have a debate on AI, because I have on transhumanism, because I have two colleagues who are very fond of those subjects. But I would like to ask you, and that's what I was asking, can we reform Canada? If Canada does not exist, we don't have a constitution. How do we do this now?
Well, that for me is the biggest perplexing thing. You know, it's I don't have an answer for that directly, because it's like I intellectually know certain things that need to happen if Canada is going to become a viable culture and nation founded upon principles of natural law. Like, so I know through my research in deep history, philosophy, and more recently the Canadian experience, I know what's lacking. I know what the oligarchy has done to us to keep us enmeshed in an illusion. And I know what is needed, what the oligarchy would be afraid of, were they to actually lose their influence over this very highly prized strategic battleground that is Canada as a territory. It's highly valued by the empire, highly valued, more than people realize.
We have very big national resources.
Oh,
it's a
yeah.
huge territory.
Oh, big time. Yeah. So, you know, I think the primary motive for the oligarchy, the biggest priority in the last 2.5 centuries, 250 years, has been generally the destruction of the USA. Because the USA's display of what it was able to do in 1776 is something that was a genie that was very difficult to put back in the bottle. That love of liberty and that idea that we can defy empire spread like fire around the world. And it's been, they tried many times to destroy it physically. The War of 1812, the US Civil War, which had a lot to do with foreign British and French imperial intrigues, especially Canadian, that played a big role in organizing that. But those efforts failed, and they put more of their energy into destroying it from within, utilizing their fifth columns, you know, the occult underground within America's oligarchical establishment, the treacherous families that remained behind and were always there, that worked to destroy America, create a rot from within. So they did that, and they did that pretty well. But there's still something viable. I think that with Canada, like one of the roles that we've played has been preventing a US-Russian alliance from emerging, which would involve such things like the development of the Arctic, the Bering Strait rail line. That
you were mentioning that. I read your last article, and I was very fascinated, because it was an initiative that was there even during the era of the Tsarism with Nicolas II.
Yeah,
I was shocked, and my wife was shocked. She said, "I didn't know about this."
Yeah, it was big, and Alexander II, Alexander III, Nicholas II, were all in favor of this, as were many Americans. A lot of Lincoln Americans were all promoting this. A lot of Chinese were also promoting this, like the 100-day reformers in 1894, 1895 were promoting this thing as part of an idea for a new type of society founded upon win-win cooperation, breaking free of the Hobbesian doctrine of might makes right and survival of the fittest.
Might makes right, yes.
We were going to finally get over that as a species by finding our higher self-interest in creation of better states of perfectibility into the future through big projects like this. Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace, his vice president, had alliances and common strategic plans with their Russian and Chinese counterparts, especially the Russians, to revive the Bering Strait program. It's documented by Foreign Minister Molotov as well as Henry Wallace, to break the world free of the systems of colonial enslavement and introduce a system of national cooperation based on these types of big projects. John F. Kennedy had a similar attempt to revive it in his own way. Eisenhower had a weaker but still viable effort to end the Cold War, except his efforts were undone when Stalin died like a week before they were supposed to meet. So you had this whole tendency, and Canada's been sort of a wedge in much of these cases, preventing that type of old world, new world cooperation around big scale projects. So I know that if we were going to begin to build, we need a proper practicable vision that satisfies two categories of being both necessary and being possible. And I say that way because many things which are possible are not necessarily always necessary, and many things which are necessary are not always possible. So you want to look for those things that shape both categories of being necessary and possible, of which I would say, based on this historic current, Donald Trump's executive order endorsing the construction of a Canada-Alaska railway that would connect down into the lower 48 states, which he did in September of 2020, gets us into that domain. There's things that involve, building continental water projects like the North American Water and Power Alliance. There's all sorts of things that would involve taking on, because to do all of these things in a sustainable way, you need to deal with the cancer of the Wall Street financialization of the economy that's run by a bunch of high priests that manage the world through speculative finance. And this has to be dealt with, because it's going to collapse and it's going to take us down with it if we don't deal with it now by breaking up the banks the way it was done in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt, which involved,
with after that, when I remember when they separated the bank of deposit with the bank of investment, not playing, both sides, but it was broken after that in that 1999 with Clinton.
Yeah, I mean, it had been castrated over decades prior to Clinton, but the final death nail was Clinton's destruction of Glass-Steagall. But that can be done. The Glass-Steagall, I think, is, if we don't talk about that, which Trump is not doing, maybe that's because Scott Bessent and other billionaire Wall Street types are very influential around him, and so he doesn't think he's allowed to speak about it anymore. He spoke about it a little bit one time in 2017, and then he stopped, and he hasn't brought it up again. So even though I support, like every nation should have the right to utilize protectionism to cultivate their industry, their manufacturing, and to protect it from the dumping of cheap goods from abroad. That should be, everybody should be doing that, should always have been doing that. We never should have stopped. But if you just do that and you don't take on the Wall Street banks, it doesn't mean anything in my mind.
Yes, you're right.
So that need to be discussed. We need to have I would say that a freedom movement has to learn how to bring this type of strategic action based on historic and scientific principles into the discourse and rally and organize around them, instead of just having a romantic vision around liberty and breaking free of Ottawa or something, which is very lowbrow and not sustainable. That's what got a lot of people killed in 1837, 38. When they were romantics, they didn't take the time to learn what they were up against, and they all got killed and destroyed or sent off to Australia. And I see sort of a recurrence of a lot of this soft-mindedness in too many good people around me right now, all across the board in Canada, who are they're not moving their minds enough to appreciate what could be done to undo the influence of the oligarchy and increase freedom.
But okay, we've passed 1 hour 40 minutes. I could keep you with me for 10 hours. I would be very happy. But you mentioned something very important: maturity. And I see, and there's Pierre Vallière, who was an intellectual, Quebec intellectual, and he wrote Nègre Blanc d'Amérique, Black Nigger of America, and he wrote many. He was part of the FLQ. And he was always promoting, he was a Marxist, but also he was saying, you have to prepare the revolution but never do it. And the idea was quite interesting because you have to define golden strategies. And I think you're right, with what is happening in Alberta. They're reacting with anger and fear. They're not reacting like they want to separate from Canada, but they don't have any project, like they don't project themselves in the future. So go ahead, sorry.
No, you're right. You have to project yourself mentally into the future and put yourself into the position of somebody living 30 years, 40 years in the future and thinking, what
from now, yes.
Yeah, every good revolutionary that does something sustainable and effective does that. They all make this very real. The future and the past are very real for them, and that's the Achilles heel. And I love going to Alberta. I go there frequently. I love talking to conservative, freedom-minded people. They're good. They're the best people that I know in Canada, and yet despite that, I get sad because these attributes that we're discussing are so far removed from what I typically encounter. There are exceptions, but there's an intellectual laziness and a desire to act too emotionally that is going to result in a lot of disappointing effects, I fear. And I think the oligarchy, which thinks on a very sophisticated level, like look, for example, we can have a whole discussion at some point. I wrote several chapters with a colleague in France about Operation Gladio in Canada, and a lot of the unreconstructed Pétain Nazi collaborators that were brought into Quebec around Adrien Arcand's network that didn't disappear after World War II. They took on a new form, just like they did in Prince Bernhard and the creation of the Bilderberg Group and all of those things that we know about of the European branches of the NATO secret armies. But the same thing was active in Canada. And I can tell you what, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, who was the editor-in-chief for Cité Libre, and who
Cité Libre, that's very important what you're mentioning, yes.
Yeah, him and his buddy, René Lévesque, were both writers for Cité Libre. Pierre-Elliott Trudeau was promoting the personal, like him, Jean Marchand, they were all part of this network that was run out of the Université de Laval under what's his name? Father Georges-Henri Lévesque, the follower of Aldous Huxley, this Dominican, I would say Satanist. I think he's the evidence I've seen, he's a pedophile Satanist out of the Université de Laval, working with Rhodes scholars like Jean Beetz and Guérin Lajoie, who were all Rhodes scholars from Oxford, part of this whole mercenary class infused to destroy the Union Nationale government and influence, extract and eliminate the influence of Christianity from having any political influence in Quebec, and to create a new technocratic regime change, a technocratic revolution, which became the Quiet Revolution. And out of that, the FL, like when I look at Cité Libre, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, when he got into politics, he gave over the keys of the Cité Libre editorial management to Pierre Vallière. Yeah, who then took over directly from Pierre-Elliott Trudeau to run Cité Libre. And the FLQ, I've got a chapter in my book. This thing was kind of like the Red Brigades of Italy or Germany or the Weather Underground that were being managed as nominally Marxist-Leninist terrorist cells for useful idiots on the low level who would put in, do mailbox bombings and stuff. But on the higher levels of management, they were run through a network, a department inside of the RCMP. Jean Marchand was a big person playing
a role in that. That's very fascinating.
P. Elliott Trudeau knew exactly what that was, because the point of all of this was to do a final purge of the Republican or the Christian resistance within politics, which they wanted to do martial law as part of the purge. And so, the British Foreign Office, the French embassy, the French fascist networks that were still operating with the shadow government in Quebec were doing this together. That involved the intended murder of Daniel Johnson Sr. that happened 2 years earlier. Pierre Laporte, the deputy
1967, when he was, Daniel Johnson Sr., he died of a heart attack, but that's the official version.
Yeah, no autopsy, right? So who's going to say
no autopsy?
So I don't believe that. And like at the unveiling of the Manicouagan 5 Dam, that was his lifelong baby, his project.
Yes,
it is bullshit.
I worked 23 years for Hydro-Quebec, and I studied the history of Hydro-Quebec through this political event, and I'm happy that you mentioned Quebec, because if we go, that's maybe the sense of what Michael Jones would talk about, harmony. You go from unity to diversity, and then you come back to unity. And we go from local politics or local subject to more higher subject, international, spiritual, eschatological subject. And then we can come back to something that is more local. I will ask you, Matthew, what are your next project while I show your actual book? What's your next project? Because I see now, I found those 3 books on your website: Mystery Babylon and the Age of Aquarius, and then I see the picture of Nikola Tesla. I said, shit, it's another very interesting subject, energy, because I'm fond of this, rational approach on energy. So Rosicrucian Golem. The title are extraordinary. The Golem, Edgar Poe, Final Unsolved Mystery. So what are your other books? What are your future projects, and where we can find all your work? I know you're on X. I posted the bottom here, Substack and your website. So what are your other books?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for promoting that stuff. Yeah, those are the most recent 3. But before that, I wrote a 4-volume book series called The Clash of the Two Americas. Mm-hmm. There's an unofficial volume 5 called Science Unshackled: Restoring Causality in a World of Chaos, which deals sort of with the clash of the two sciences. Before that, I published, these were all published with my wife. Before that, the volumes 1 to 4 of the Untold History of Canada. Volume 1 is written by one of my mentors, a former teacher who broke away from the academic cage. That's volume 1 was written by him, and I did volumes 2, 3, and 4 of the Untold History of Canada. More recently, we started getting into filmmaking. So we have joined forces with a very talented filmmaker named Jason Dahl.
I know Jason Dahl. I know him because he was on Election Canada Night, and Payman Ascari was in Vancouver. Introduced him to me.
He's brilliant. Yeah. And I've been working with him now for about 3 years, making videos and documentaries, which has been a lot of fun. And more recently, we put out just last week, episode 4, a 75-minute film on the Untold History of Canada film series. So we're doing a whole series of maybe 8 or 9 of these, dealing with the occult intelligence agencies and psyops behind the UFO disclosure operation, which goes back.
Roswell and all the.
Yeah, the most recent episode deals entirely with the fallacy of Roswell, the creation of a new legend. That's available on my website. and we're working on episode 5, as well as a new Mark Carney episode. So we've done 2 episodes of a Mark Carney, the dystopic mission of Mark Carney. They're shorter pieces, shorter little videos, and we're just finishing up, or we're working on episode 3 currently. And if people want to help with those, you know, we're raising funds as well from people who want to see these things manifest, because it does take a lot of time and resources. So on our website, CanadianPatriot.org, there's places to offer a donation and support the filmmaking and stuff too.
Perfect. And you're mentioning this, and I think it's important. That's why I asked you the question earlier, what about the future of information? Considering that the mainstream media, even if they are subsidized by the government with billions of dollars, they're losing their audience. And I'm sorry to say that I'm a boomer. I'm 65 years old, and I say to people, when the mainstream media will disappear, it's when the boomers will die. So, but it's true. You have a vast majority of people who are connected to. They were born in with TV, so it's hard for them to get out of this their traditional or classical way of having information or entertainment or knowledge. So that's a good. I think the future of information or knowledge will go through alternative media, but like you, I don't know how it will be, how it will unfold. Anyway, Matthew, thank you a lot for this conversation. I had so much question, but my wife, she always tell me, just shut up and let them speak. So that's what I try to do, because when we discover your work, we can organize a lot of debates, real debates, you know, like you mentioned, not something that is oriented. So thanks a lot for your presence. And like I said, I remind all the people who are interested in your book to follow you on X, on Substack, and on the website, the Canadian Patriot Review. And I encourage people to go and read the article and your new series that will be extremely fascinating, I'm sure, because your method is, you developed a method and a structured method with Plato. I was just wanted to say, when you were talking about Plato, maybe Plato was a whistleblower of his time.
Yeah, the guy was a whistle. He was an intellectual warrior, like such a warrior. It's people don't fully realize what he did, but I think they will. They will at some point when society gets our collective heads out of our asses. We're going to reevaluate a lot of these philosophers and see them in a much different light and realize what they were. But yeah, Plato he's such an incredible character. It boggles my mind.
Exactly. Anyway, thank you a lot, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your presence. And until the next episode of The Philosophy of Information, I wish you a good weekend. So, thanks, Matt.
Bye.